Strive presents. Oh, got to get ready.
Laptop. Plant, that looks nice there.
Ooh, cookies, yum.
Notebook.
Microphone, webcam, and coffee, of course. A video podcast where deaf, hard of hearing, and disabled creatives and their allies chat about experiences, best practice, and the future of the arts. The Green Room.
Ramps on the Moon. Take over.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the latest episode of The Green Room, which is brought to you by the Strive Collective. This is a series of podcasts, video podcasts, audio podcasts, where we speak to disabled and deaf artists from within the theatre industry and their allies about all things access and disability from within the theatre industry. And this particular series of episodes is a Ramps on the Moon takeover, and all about the making of Ramps on the Moon and Leeds Playhouse's production of Oliver Twist, which originally premiered at Leeds Playhouse in March 2020, and then because the world ended, was brought to a swift halt, and then thankfully was brought back again in autumn 2021 to be filmed and streamed live online. And this series of conversations is all about the making of that show. That show featured if I say so myself, a very talented group of deaf, disabled and non-disabled people to make the show, and integrated audio description and BSL and captioning in wonderfully creative ways, so that hopefully that show was incredibly accessible to as many people as possible. And we wanted to share some of the things we learned whilst making that show. And this episode in particular is entitled The Blind Perspective, which I've decided is going to be the name of my new band. And I'm actually going to take over this episode and invite the two people here with me to join that band. So this is all specifically about the experience of the blind and visually impaired people involved in making that show, but also what we did to try and make that show accessible to blind and visually impaired audiences, and what we sort of learned and what we'd want to share with the world about what we learned trying to do that. I think that's everything I needed to say and as part of this introduction. So now I'd like to introduce the people who are going to be involved in today's conversation. And I'll start with the most important person, me. My name is Benjamin Wilson, his full name. I was actually a guest on the previous series of The Green Room, and now I've been promoted to host, which I'm very flattered about. And the power's already going to my head. I am a visually impaired / blind actor, theatre maker, and audio description consultant. On Oliver Twist, I was in the cast. I played Mr Bumble and trumpet, and I was also one of two audio description consultants on the show as well. And to audio describe myself briefly, I am a white man with short, at the moment, blonde hair that is thinning and receding faster than I'd like it to. I've got a bit of a scruffy, stubbly beard going on. I'm wearing a big, chunky, sort of maroonish jumper. And I'm sat at a desk in my home office / spare room. And behind me on the plain wall is a framed picture of my Lord and Saviour, Marcelo Bielsa. And that's me. My sign name is Ben, which is two flat hands going into the shape of a bin, sort of like the outline of a bin, which I can explain why it's that, but we haven't got time. Today, interpreting what I say into BSL is a wonderful BSL interpreter, Dave. So Dave, do you want to audio describe yourself and introduce yourself?
Hi there, so my name is Dave Wycherley. I'm a BSL interpreter, and I worked on the team of interpreters through Oliver Twist. I'm a white man. I have short, grey hair, stubbly beard, and I'm sat in front of a blue screen. And that's me.
Fabulous. Thank you very much, Dave. I'm now going to hand over to Chloe. Chloe, why don't you introduce yourself?
Oh, well, thank you, Ben. I will. I'm Chloe Clarke. Just like your job description, Ben, I'm an actor, theatre maker, and audio description consultant. And on Oliver Twist, I was the other audio description consultant. I'm a white woman in my early 20s or late 30s, depending on who you want to believe, which side of me you want to believe. I am wearing a red cardi with a salmon stripy jumper underneath and a multicoloured necklace. Got long, dark, unruly hair and freckles, and I'm sitting in front of a very blurred background because I didn't want you to see quite how disgustingly messy my office room is. I am being interpreted by Susan. Susan, would you like to describe yourself?
Hello, my name is Susan Merrick. I'm a sign language interpreter. I am sat in front of a green background. I have a black jumper on. I'm a white woman, around 40, and I have ginger hair to my shoulders.
Lovely, thank you very much. You too. Over to John Biddle.
Hello everyone, I'm John. I did the sound design for the show, and in doing that I worked very closely with these guys, but also with a wonderful composer called Oliver Vibrans. I think he only got the job because he was called Oliver. I am a white man, and I've got a green beanie hat on and a green sweatshirt. And I can rival Ben for receding hair. Look at that. And the beanie just stops the light from glinting off it for an hour. And I'm being interpreted by the lovely Vicky, so I'll hand over to Vicky now.
Hello, my name's Vicky Ackroyd. My sign name is Vicky, so like you're chewing all of your fingernails one by one, because I've got a really bad habit of chewing my fingernails. I'm a white woman. I'm not going to disclose my age. I'm sitting in front of a blue screen, and I'm wearing a black top, two black tops because it's very cold today, and have black glasses and shoulder length brown, light brown.
Very good, thank you very much. I'm always really impressed that like sighted people are always really honest when they audio describe themselves, whereas like blindies and VIPs, we always take the opportunity to just go, yeah, we are gorgeous. Like, yeah, I think for me, just imagine sort of mid-90s Brad Pitt. That's what you need to think about. But yeah, so I thought we'd start with I sort of think we should avoid in this conversation doing the sort of basics on audio description, because there is a previous episode of The Green Room where I was interviewed by the wonderful Claire Louise English about audio description more broadly. So if you are sort of brand new to audio description and how you can do it better, maybe start there and then come to this one. So I don't want to repeat everything that we said in that one, but I thought it might be useful to start this conversation with sharing a bit about how we approached the audio description on Oliver Twist. Just for people who didn't see the show, they can have a bit of understanding of they've got a bit of a way in to know what the hell we're talking about. And you two, Chloe and John, feel free to chip in and interrupt if I get this wrong, and there are bits that I'm forgetting. But broadly, the tools we used to make the show accessible to blind and visually impaired audiences were trying to integrate audio description into the dialogue so that it made sense without audio description. I'm thinking specifically of a moment like, there's a moment in the show where Bill Sykes holds a gun to Oliver's head and threatens him, and without the visuals you might not know what's going on there. So we had Nancy say, Bill, don't point the gun at Oliver, put the gun down please. And then when he did, she said, oh my goodness, thank God for that, which tells the story through the dialogue. We then used John's and Oliver's brilliant sound design and music to help tell those stories, so help tell those visual stories. So in that moment, there was, as well as being the dialogue, there was also sound design and music that was sort of creating the tension of that moment of the gun being pointed at Oliver's head, and what's going to happen? Is he going to get shot? And then that sort of relaxed and became a much more calm soundscape when the gun had been lowered. And then there were also moments we had characters in Oliver Twist, in this version of this adaptation of Oliver Twist that was brilliantly adapted by Bryony Lavery, where there were these characters called the Us, who were sort of narrators, storytellers, chorus type characters. From all of the characters in the show came out of the Us, and sometimes they would act as more traditional audio describers, but hopefully in a more characterful and fun way than traditional audio description. So I'm thinking about the moments where they say things like, Mr Bumble peruses his notebook, and Mrs Mann peruses her notebook, more traditional audio description. So that's sort of hopefully an introduction to how we approached the audio description on this show, so you have a bit of context for what we're talking about. But I wanted to start with you, John, with a question for you, as you were sort of the newbie to this sort of stuff, to audio description and aural storytelling, and trying to make a show accessible to blind and visually impaired audiences. And I suppose, what were the sort of the headline things that you learned and that you're taking away with you from having worked on this show?
Yeah. Well, firstly, I think I need to go back and watch the beginners episode, because I was very much a beginner coming to this. And yeah, I think the big takeaways, I was trying to have a think of, it's good when you've had a bit of space from the project, you can sort of go to the key takeaways a bit more easily, I think. And I started thinking about what it had done to my process and for my process, and realized that loads of the things that are led by you guys and by the process, and putting the perspective of a blind or visually impaired audience into the thinking all the way through, was that I guess it just forced a level of rigor onto the storytelling choices, which really, in a way, completely separate to access, just means for that you could just read "get better at your job," because I think that's what sound design should be doing all the time. I think it's very easy to think of yourself when you're in sort of sound design mode as in charge of making like really kind of zhuzhy, sexy sounds, like really cool sounding whooshes and rumbles. But I really think that's, you know, that's part of the fun. But in the end, the first job, and the main job without which you're not doing your job, is to clarify the storytelling alongside everyone else on the team, the actors, the director, the writer, and so on. And so it just forced choices to be really clear, I hope. About locations, it's a very fluid production, so sound had a big role to play in taking us perhaps just on a word from one location to another, giving the little motifs to characters so we know who's entering the frame, who's entering the space, and crucial kind of story beats. For example, great example in this story is the locket, which is a great sort of story device in this tale, which so, you know, just very simply, simplistically almost, just giving it a sound, and so whenever that comes up, pops up dramaturgically, you always clock it, and so then you're sort of in alliance with the dramaturgical work of the writer, I guess. So yeah, my big takeaway was that it just was all about, you know, forcing myself to be better, really, and to pay attention to really clear storytelling.
Yeah, John, be better.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think that's really interesting, actually, because I've found so often during rehearsals with my hat on of audio description consultant, if I brought up a moment to say this story beat at the moment, or this moment of the story isn't clear aurally, this story beat doesn't have the clarity without the visuals, actually the response from everyone else in the room was actually, yeah, you're right, that story beat isn't clear for everyone. That is just somewhere that is an important moment in the story that at the moment we really need to work on making sure it works for everyone. And it's one of the sort of sound bites I often wheel out in these conversations, is actually when you make a show, you know, when you make the access on a show better and more creative and more interesting and more engaging, it doesn't just improve the experience for, in this instance, a blind and visually impaired audience, but for everyone. Like making the story really clear aurally, particularly with a story like a Dickensian thing, where it is quite a complicated story, where you're trying to keep track of who's who and where we are. Actually, that helps everyone, and also not just from an access point of view, but from sort of an engagement and entertaining point of view, because that's something I always bring it back to. It's not just about making the show accessible to blind and visually impaired audiences. It's about entertaining and engaging that audience. And actually, if you're making the show a real treat to listen to aurally, and really delicious and gorgeous, as we, you know, with Oliver's music and John's sound design, like we make it really joyous and entertaining and gripping through the sounds, that doesn't just help a blind and visually impaired audience. Who doesn't want to be treated, have their senses treated? Yeah, I think that's really interesting.
Completely agree. Yeah, it's just, I mean, that's again another of the giant joys and joyous discoveries for me of starting this access journey, integrated access journey, is just it does make the work better, and it makes the whole thing comes out a better piece of work. So yeah.
Hey. So Chloe, as I said, people heard me bang on about audio description in a previous episode of the Green Room. Now it's your turn. No, you would never bang on. You're always entertaining and engaging and intelligent about this stuff. But why should people care about the audio description and the aural storytelling in their show? What's wrong with just doing it, in a traditional manner? And why was it important to you, on this show, to not just approach audio description in a traditional way and to do it in a more interesting and progressive manner?
Well, that's a really good question, Ben. It follows follows succinctly on from exactly what you were just talking about, and it is that when people start to embrace access in a creative and interesting way, what they start to find is that it actually informs their creative process overall, and it makes the show a much more interesting and enticing and engaging show for everybody. And I think one of the reasons that it hasn't been happening for the most part, and that it's it's kind of slow progressing, is because people think of AD in this traditional sense. It's very hard. So anyone who is even aware of AD in the first place, and lots of people aren't, so you first of all have to explain what it is, and then you have to say, but actually that isn't the form, that sort of traditional sense of AD isn't the form that we want to encourage, because it is the preconception or the misconception about it is that it gets in the way of the creative process, and that it very much impedes your creative vision, say as a writer or a director, because you have established your vision for this piece for, unbeknownst to you, a sighted audience, and then you have to suddenly go, but now we need to make it accessible for the VI audience or blind audience, so we need to layer on this audio description track on top of it, and if that was audible to everybody, it would get in the way and it would be terrible for the sighted audience. And I think one of the biggest barriers that we face is that people who do consider AD still think of it as that sort of external narrative voice, like Ben puts down the glass and walks across the room, and it doesn't,
I do that a lot, to be fair.
You do that a lot, it's true, but you don't need to audio describe it in that way, Ben, do you? And that's the thing. So it's about finding creative ways to describe things that don't impede the artistic vision for the piece or the process or the experience for the sighted audience. And I think that's what we're having to overcome, this barrier of making AD stealthy, invisible and natural, so that it's there and it's providing all the relevant information, but it's not noticeable. And for me as a visually impaired audience member, the reason I got into this in the first place was because the last thing I want to do is go and sit in a theatre and plonk on a headset and be completely isolated from the people I'm there with and listen to one other person's interpretation of what's happening in front of me, which aims to be objective but can't be, because that's a fallacy in the first place. There's no such thing. So finding creative and integrated ways to incorporate AD from the outset of a project into a piece is definitely, I feel, the way forward for audio description. That said, I think it needs to be acknowledged that there are different groups of people who prefer the traditional form of AD because they know what they're getting. It's a convention. They go to the theatre, they know they're going to put a headset on and get that access. So it's great that that's offered, and some people do prefer it. But more often than not, it's offered once per season on a Tuesday matinee. So it's only good for people who don't work anyway. We are hugely excluded from theatre in the sense that access just simply isn't provided. or if it is, it's provided once in a blue moon. And the integration and creative use of AD just means that every performance you do is going to be accessible to VI audiences, just inherently. And that is the way everything should be, frankly.
Absolutely.
It's interesting what you said about people, maybe not being sure about which they would prefer, and maybe preferring to go with what they know. And I guess there's an element of earning their confidence by creatively integrating it well. And so then they go, okay, yeah, this actually is, and it is a real skill. And having seen you two at work, there's such a kind of class deftness to the way you can just impart the crucial thing, sometimes with a sigh or a word or a tiniest thing that really doesn't, to my ears, alter the line or the sense or the style of the language. It just, like you say, stealthily, invisibly and beautifully just drops it in. So it's a real skill.
It's really interesting. Like the invisible thing is a really interesting one. I think it's a really crucial part of why audio description traditionally has lagged behind, and the theatre industry has not done the work it should have done by now to improve the quality of audio description or take pride in doing creative audio description. Is because it's so easy to ignore. Because if it's done in a traditional manner, ironically, you can't see it. It's invisible. It's happening over there. If you've not got the headsets on, then you don't know it's happening. And so as an artist making a show, it's really easy to sort of wash your hands of it and think, oh, it's over there, I don't need to think about it. Whereas if you compare that to something like captioning or BSL interpretation, you can't ignore it because it's right there. It's right on your stage. And which I think gives people more encouragement and more, it forces people to think about it more. Whereas audio description is easy to ignore, which I think is why a lot of people do ignore it. And also, you're right, John, about like giving people a confidence to say this is a tool you can play with. I think people who don't use audio description cited artists who make theatre who it blows my, I think I probably said this in the last episode I did of this podcast, but it blows my mind how many directors, writers, producers, actors, whatever it might be, just don't even engage with the audio description on their shows. They just ignore it. Because they think of it as something that happens over there. It's not my responsibility. It's nothing to do with me. And actually, we need to give people a confidence to say, yes, it is. This is an artistic, creative tool that's at your fingertips. Come and play with it. Come and enjoy it. Come and get stuck in.
Yeah, it's a creative opportunity, isn't it? That's the main thing. And that's what I think we've got a long way to go to persuade people of. Because once they do, by and large, I've worked with so many companies and individuals and venues and artists, and every single time I work with them, they come out of it going, oh, I've learned, not just that I've learned so much about AD, but I've learned so much about my own process. And actually, this really enhances my work. And, Ben, you and I work with every creative in the room when we're consulting. We work with the writer, the director, and all of the performers. And you end up sort of being in a role of sort of, you have to provoke a lot, don't you? And ask a lot of questions, particularly of the actors, because really getting to the nitty gritty of why the AD is there, you need to ask the actors why they are doing X, Y, and Z, why they have made that choice to do whatever they're doing physically or whatever, and then you have to interrogate them, and that process really brings out so much more from the actors and the writer and the director, and you just find that you leave the process having experienced actually how much of an opportunity this is. So it's sort of like you've got to try it before you realize exactly how optimizing it is for your project, and not an obstacle, but actually something that really, really informs and helps your process be much more creative.
Absolutely. And just to pick on something you said earlier about people preferring the tradition. Some groups of people prefer the audio description done in a traditional way, done in a way they know, and I think that's because the assumption amongst visually impaired audiences and blind audiences is that theatre is an inaccessible art form to me. This is not, because 99% of it is. Yeah. And so as an industry, we need to work hard to the most depressing thing about that assumption is that they're normally right. It's normally true. And actually, audio description is something, the traditional form, at least I know I've got that safety blanket of that. So there's going to be someone there to describe this to me if I get lost. And I think that is something that John said about actually earning the trust to actually, no, we've got you here. When we say this is integrated into the show, we mean it. We're not lying. We've done the work. I think there's something interesting about early. I think there's something about actually in Oliver Twist early on in the show is where we did a lot of the heavy lifting in terms of the more traditional form of audio description done by the chorus, by the us, because it's like almost like early on you want to set up this up like, we've got you. This is you don't need to worry. This is going to work. And I think that's interesting. I think there's also something I agree with you, Chloe, about the most satisfying form of audio description as an audience member is when you don't notice it, when it's invisible, it just happens. But also there's a fine line there between it, aiming for that, but also taking pride in the fact that you've done this and not sort of being ashamed of the fact that you're audio describing this show and trying to hide it away because it's something to be embarrassed about. Actually, where are the moments where you can take pride in saying, yeah, we're audio describing this. This has helped define our creative vision for this show, is the fact that we want to make it accessible and we want it to be an accessible show, and that has informed our way of making the show. I think that's really exciting. Yeah. Is those moments when you say, we're not ashamed of this, we're not hiding it away. This is one of the tools in our one of the weapons in our arsenal, or paints in your paint box. And actually that sort of leads on to the next question that I had planned, or one of the next questions I had planned, that was, what worked in Oliver Twist? To bring it back to Oliver Twist, where are the moments that we think, yeah, that is a really good example of how this should work? That's why we're so proud of this from an AD point of view. And for me, and this is a moment that had nothing to do with me, so I feel like I'm able to say it was brilliant, is the scene where Nancy is killed by Bill Sikes. Spoiler alert, sorry, it came out 150 years ago. You should have read it by now. But is that the whole, before I even sort of read a first draft of the script, this was already in there, was that the sort of premise for that scene is Nancy is audio describing her own death whilst Bill enacts it through VV for the benefit of deaf audiences. And the reasoning for that was, we need to make this scene accessible. The reasoning for that was, no one wants to see a woman getting beaten to death on stage. It's actually better for everyone to hear it audio described, to have it audio described to you. And who else better to do that from an emotive point of view and an artistic point of view than the person it's happening to? And for me, that is a perfect example of saying these artistic access tools are going to define how we make the show and how we want to tell this story. And they're not here as access tools, they're here as storytelling tools. And that really, really excited me the first time I read the first draft of the script, going, yes, this is incredible, this is amazing. And for me, that would be one of the moments where I'm like, that I found really exciting, and that is something to learn from in the future. I don't know if either of you have any particular moments or any particular examples of how Oliver Twist worked well from an audio description point of view.
Well, I think the establishing of different groups within the story, and this is where I think one of the real, another sort of takeaway is involve it in the thinking as early as possible, like at the very beginning, because then it informs everything. And like we've already gone on about, those informed choices just improve things. So I think that the allocating of different groups to different parts of that journey, whether it's audio description. So I think the us, this wonderful voice that the us has, I think they're one of my favourite choral ensemble elements in a show I've seen for ages. And that's not a new idea, to have a chorus who kind of take you through a story, but it's one of my favourites, and they have a really distinct voice. And that undoubtedly comes from a choice and a need and an aim for them to have this role in audio describing action, as well as narrating story and so on. And then, of course, then you go to the BSL involvement in Fagin's gang, and suddenly you're like, wow, that's so brilliant, that's so great. And then one of the gang members being a blind person is like that just enhances this whole notion. And so then you've got these deft ways of Charlie and Dodger overseeing or eavesdropping on things and telling each other about it, and it all just comes through in such beautiful and brings so many layers to these different groups. So I guess to me it's that connecting of access choices to character groups and to the story itself. I also totally agree with that about Nancy's death. It's just a brilliant way to show what's a really horrific act, and doesn't make it any less. I'm sort of joking up, even just picturing it now. It doesn't make it any less shocking or violent or vile, but it tells it in an artistic, creative way, which is great.
Yeah, it actually makes it a lot more ghostly and chilling in a way, doesn't it? And you had the physical action being done by Stephen Collins on stage for the deaf audience as well. So you had both access needs covered in a equally gripping way, and that was really clever use of both sort of, I don't know, VV almost. Well, it wasn't VV, but it was just physical action from Stephen and the incidental AD of the way that Bryony wrote it. Yeah, John, you picked out every single instance I was going to talk about, and that's brilliant because, yeah, I think, and in a much more clever way. I think for me, one of the biggest successes really was the process, and I think it was working with everyone in the room and everyone being as equally invested in it as we as AD consultants were, you know. From Amy the director to you, John, and all the performers, and Bryony the writer. It's just absolutely everyone constantly thinking about it, which is a tall feat, especially for actors, because you've got so much going on, you're already thinking about everything else, and then often people would stop the scene themselves and throw in an idea or a suggestion for an AD line because they were conscious that might not be clear to the VI audience. And you know, it's always really, really thrilling when everyone in the room is working that cohesively to cover all access needs. And I think that was the atmosphere that Amy set up very first of all in that room, wasn't it? We are all equally responsible here for everyone's access needs and the audience's access needs. You know, we are all here to tell the story in all of these different ways and make sure that we don't leave any stone unturned. And I think that was the best approach you can possibly take. And it needs that direction from the outset to set that tone and set that expectation of everybody, and people always live up to it, you know. So for me, I think the biggest success was just having everyone's inputs all the time, and also I think one of the biggest obstacles was the notion that the Fagan's gang are BSL only. Originally that was the idea, they would only communicate in BSL, which instantly creates a huge barrier for the VI audience. So absolutely. Yeah, working our way around that and particularly working with Caro and Stephen and the deaf actors to incorporate just the odd word or, you know, whatever they were comfortable with, because obviously they're asking them to sign and speak English at the same time is impossible as well. So you know, really negotiating and compromising and feeling our way both from the deaf and the blind perspective together, working together, I thought was a really positive, you know, we came out with great outcomes, I think, and it was a really positive experience for everyone in the end. It was tricky, but we did it together, and that was
absolutely. I would completely echo that in terms of the atmosphere and in the room and the culture of we're all taking responsibility. And for me it comes from absolutely from Amy setting that tone. I think that is one of Amy's great skills as a director, is creating a positive culture and environment in a rehearsal room where everyone supports each other and gets each other's backs, and it just makes it a joy to be a part of a show that she's directing. I'd also say it comes from, there's a stage direction on the very first page of the script of Bryony's adaptation that says exactly that when it's describing the us, saying the us takes responsibility for telling this story to everyone. You know, they all interpret when they need to, they describe when they need to, all those things. And actually, for me, that set the tone, actually, because that was true of the characters on stage, but also true of us as actors. It's we all took responsibility for that. And for me, it was, I found it quite moving and emotional at times. There was, as you said, some of those scenes with the Fagin's gang being quite tricky. I remember one day in particular, we worked on, this time around when we remounted for the filming, we were working on the scene where Dodger meets Oliver for the first time. Oliver meets the Artful Dodger for the first time, which is one of the best scenes in the show in general, just because two brilliant actors being brilliant together. But it was one of the scenes that maybe first time around I'd sort of flagged up as, and in general, you know, it was a very BSL heavy scene, as it should be because of the content of that scene. But it was one of those scenes that actually was going to be quite tricky from an AD point of view. And so the sort of afternoon we spent working on that scene this time around for the remount was so incredible for me, because it was exactly that. It was the best example I remember of there being a room full of people, from the actors on stage to the director to the sound designer to you know, even the stage management, and everyone in that room really taking responsibility, and everyone chucking in ideas and getting really excited about how we creatively tell this story to a blind audience. And for me, that was the moment I don't mind admitting, at the end of that afternoon, I had to take myself to give myself a moment to sort of compose myself, because it's mad that a non-disabled audience member goes into every theatre production, every time they go and see a show, knowing that everyone involved in that show has worked their socks off to provide them with a great experience. And actually, as a blind and visually impaired audience, I've been to the theatre hundreds of times since I lost my sight. I could probably count on one hand the amount of times I've genuinely felt like the people making the show have cared about my experience as much as everyone else's. Yeah. And that's all I ever really ask for, is for the creatives making a show to, you know, I promised not to swear during this podcast, I nearly did then, but to care about, to give a damn about my experience as an audience member. That's all I want. There's something that non-disabled people take for granted, I think, in that every piece of art pretty much is created with people like them in mind. Yeah. And so to have that afternoon in a rehearsal room where I knew, and it was so clear that every single person involved in that show was not only thinking about my experience as a blind audience member, but prioritizing it and really taking great passion and heart and care over that, yeah, honestly meant the world. And I can't put into words how much that means.
You just did.
There we go.
And that was very well said. Yeah, no, it's true. It's really true. And it's astounding what a rarity it is. And one of the things I wanted to say earlier is that it's just such a rare joy and a rare opportunity to work with people like Amy and John and everyone else involved in the production, who all take it so seriously and take it as a priority and really care and really want to do their best for all of the audience, not just the narrow, you know, fraction of people who normally are considered, which is the non-disabled quotient of the audience. So yeah, it's a real, it shouldn't depend on people, individuals learning, you know, caring about, being sensitive and caring about it, but it does. And those are the people who are pioneering it and smoothing the way for other people. So hopefully, you know, when other people come and watch this work, they can be inspired by it. And I use the horrible I word, inspire. But I think, you know, in this case, it's warranted. It does need to inspire others to realize that this exists, that this issue, massive issue exists. You know, you are just always excluding a massive portion of society when you make a show that doesn't consider access from the outset and in interesting ways. And I hope that people do come away from things like this going, oh, okay, maybe that's something I could think about, and then really engage the people they're working with to do the same.
Absolutely. So leading on from that, we've talked about how wonderful and brilliant and incredible this process was, but also it was a massive learning curve for everyone involved. What, on this show in particular, you know, what did we think actually we didn't quite nail it there from an AD point of view, or that could have been better? You know, if we were starting again from scratch right now, what would we do differently? And and I suppose as part of that as well is, what are the ambitions still to come? You know, what if we were being completely wonderfully ambitious, even more ambitious with the audio description? What do we want to see what do we want to try? And I think part of that, my starting point would be actually one of the challenges, what we just touched on it, but some of those scenes that were very BSL heavy were the ones that were tricky from an AD point of view. Yeah. And I think we did a great job. It took us a long time to get there with those scenes to make them work from a blind and VI audience. If I'm being perfectly honest, I still think there are moments in there that we could have done more and could have provided more for a blind and VI audience. That would be my starting point. And also, because those scenes, we talked about how actually from the outset, if you start from the outset in terms of prioritizing this stuff, that's when it becomes, to use one of the cheesy sound bites I use all the time and I've used a lot, that's the difference between making an accessible show and making a show accessible. And if you're setting out from the outset with the AD and all this stuff and the access in mind, you're going to make an accessible show. And in those scenes, I think actually we were starting from a very difficult place. So we were never going to get those scenes that were very quiet and very BSL heavy to be as satisfying to a blind and VI audience as some of the other moments in the show. That would be my offer and my starting point on that question.
Yeah.
John, go on. You answer that question.
Well, no, I totally agree with that, and I would just start involving it early, making an accessible show, rather than thinking about it later, is super important, isn't it? And I know this isn't quite on the question, but also involve blind, deaf, visually impaired, disabled artists, because then it's not a perspective that's outside the room to remember to think about. It's so present. That you can't not. How would you not? So the room, the enforced generosity of the spirit in the room is just happens because we're humans, and so things that I just would, in a way we had a chance to do one pass at going back when we made the film version, and we were able to make a few more choices, but I would always just welcome another rake through it, to probably trim things away. I mean, that's normally a process of improving things, I think, is taking out rather than adding. But I think the clarifying of location, of person, of character, of story could definitely go further and better. We always in theatre, and now I'm learning with screen versions of things. It's just the same, really. You think you're having to draw a line through a thing, and of course it's not finished or perfect. You just have to do that, don't you? Yeah.
I'd also offer, I mean, this is probably quite a controversial opinion, and I know that it's contradicted by a lot of people, but I know that one of the strongest ideas for Oliver from the outset was this idea that Fagin's gang are deaf and they use BSL, and that is their language, and that's what separates them, and that is very much underpinning the piece. I would say perhaps if that is definitely something that you want to aim for, maybe consider making this a piece specifically really accessible for deaf people, and then think about doing another piece that's really specifically accessible for blind people. I think a lot of people try to throw too much access at a show in one go, and it ends up diluting the effectiveness of one, because you're trying to do too much at once. And I think that's something for people to be wary of when they make their own work, is to think, does this inherently lend itself better to one group or another? Would we be causing more problems or more barriers by trying to make something that is just inherently accessible to deaf people also accessible to blind? Or is it better to always aim and strive to make everything accessible to everyone? Which I would say ultimately, yes, it is, but I think you need to practice making things greatly accessible for one group and then another, and then try and combine the two when you're a bit more proficient at it. Perhaps that's always been my feeling on it anyway, is that it's really good to sort of really hone down your skills in one area and then another, and then look at combining them before you try and do it. And that's sort of part of the Ramps project. The Ramps project is we make these things accessible to everybody, and I would suggest that perhaps you don't have to do that. And when you have a very strong concept from the outset that lends itself very well to one group, maybe focus on that, and then do it another way later, or do a different show that's better for another group. So I think that's something that, yeah, I just wanted to put it out there as an idea. I know.
Yeah, I both agree and disagree with you at the same time on that front. I think, in that you're absolutely right. Like, no matter how hard you try, you're not going to make classic silent comedy accessible to me as a blind person. You know, you can try, it's not going to work. You know, having sort of visual jokes audio described to you is not funny. Like, I'm sorry, no matter how talented an audio describer is, it is never going to work. But I'm not saying cancel Laurel and Hardy. No one can ever enjoy them ever again. And it's also like, yeah, actually, you're right. I think what Amy did right as a director on this show was, knowing the show was coming up, she didn't want that to be the first time she had played with these new paints in her paint box, of making shows that were accessible to blind audiences, making shows that were accessible to deaf audiences, and then going, right, let's now try and put those two things together. I think that's a perfectly reasonable, reasonable goal. What I think is where that gets tricky is if there's a new smash hit piece of theatre that is incredibly accessible to deaf audiences and sighted audiences, but excludes me as a blind audience, and everyone in the world is talking about this brilliant show that excludes me, that's going to anger me and upset me and exclude me. And I suppose what I want is, it's that thing of, okay, making this show accessible isn't going to work, isn't going to happen. Can we provide an alternative experience that is just as good, that works just as well, in the way that here's a smash hit book that is, brilliant, that everyone's talking about. Great, we're also going to create an audiobook version that is accessible to blind and visually impaired audiences. If you've made a great piece of visual silent theatre that, wonderful, that's incredible, well done to you, that's wonderful, I'm really, really pleased and want that work to be encouraged. But also, can you find another way, an alternate method to tell that story to me and give me an experience that is not the same, but is equally as good. Whether that's, I don't know, whatever that might be. The example I always use is, I worked with a dance company a few years ago, and they asked me how could they audio describe their dance piece, and I was like, you could, it's going to be rubbish. I'm sorry, I'm sure it's great, I can't see it. But instead what we did was we commissioned a performance poet to write a poem that accompanied the same piece of music they were doing their dance to, and telling the same story and on the same issues. So it wasn't the same experience, but it was equally good one that also worked for me. And I think that's part of the thing about what you said, Chloe, about if you're programming a season of work, don't exclude me from all of it. I'm not going to be annoyed if one or two of them, doesn't quite work for me as a blind and visually impaired audience, in the same way that one or two of those pieces of work aren't going to work for me from a taste point of view, personal choice point of view, personal taste point of view, outside of my access needs. Like, no season of work at any theatre, well, maybe with some miraculous examples, are going to work for every single individual on every single show. What you want is within that, and something that is a direct offer to you and works for you. I think that's what I believe.
Totally. Yeah, no, I'm totally with you. And I think that's the solution to, it comes back to what you were saying earlier about how part of the reason that AD isn't taken up by so many people is because they're simply unaware of it, because it's invisible. It's an invisible access tool. BSL is right there in your face. It's the sexy access, let's face it, which is why most companies would integrate BSL before they even think of integrating AD. And it's also that, our brains process visual information more than any other type of information, apparently. So we're up against it in that sense, that BSL is a sexy access, and that visual stuff is what get people going and what most people just fall back on, what most people don't even think of as the way they receive information, but it is the bulk of the information they receive. So we are sort of maligned because we are the invisible group. And I think that sort of equivalent argument is really important. So even if you're not sort of racking your brains trying to, run yourself ragged trying to incorporate AD into your project, think about creating an equivalent. Think about creating just an equal experience, not the same experience. And that's always a really, really important point to make. So yeah.
And I think the point you made there, we should acknowledge as well. Integrating BSL and captions is at the moment in vogue and cool and sexy, as you put it, and that's great and wonderful. I would never want to change that. It's just, don't forget about us. Don't leave us behind as well.
Yeah.
And and
Did I sound really bitter there, Ben?
We can be sexy too, is what I'm trying to say.
Speak for yourself.
Yeah.
For yourself.
Yeah. And we're sort of coming up to the time where we need to wrap things up and finish. But I suppose I wanted to end things with, if people have watched this, listened to this, and been inspired to say, yep, I want to work with audio description and aural storytelling and make my work accessible to blind and visually impaired audiences. That is brilliant. That's my new priority as a theatre maker, as an artist, as a director, as a writer, whatever. Where should they start? Where should their starting point be? And I'll start, then let you two finish, and I'll shut up. So I'd say that the big one is just start. Just make it. Just do it. Just get on, crack on. Don't be scared of getting it wrong. That's fine. You're going to get it wrong. You're going to make mistakes. Just crack on and give it a go. No time like the present. You know, we can talk about this till the cows come home. The best thing you can do is just do it. Just get on and do it. And crack on. That'll be my first starting point.
Totally
John,
agree.
what about you? Have you got any?
No, I totally agree with that. Just start, and that can be even before making a project that it does it. Like that could be if you're an actor watching this and you go into rehearsals in the morning, start thinking about it in the rehearsal room, because you know that just happens immediately, and engage with that perspective, and then suddenly you go, oh, actually that whole scene was really clear, but this one wasn't, you know, and you're having that thought. On a more project level, you know, I know budgets are, you know, not going the wrong way, and time and money and blah 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 blah, but like, you know, it just needs to be a budget line, producers, at the very start. You know, just put it in, find it. It's got to happen. You need vans for touring. You need access in shows. You know, so it's just got to be there, and involve blind and visually impaired and deaf and disabled artists. They're amazing, obviously, and then it just happens. Don't think it means doing something completely different. It's just storytelling at the end of the day, and clear storytelling, like we've said earlier in this conversation, so I won't go over it again, but clear storytelling is clear storytelling, and more often than not, if you think about these different access points of view, you'll only improve the overall level, as we've said. So I don't think it means sort of starting again and creating a whole new style of what you do. It just means thinking from different angles. Yeah, that's what I think.
And Chloe?
So you've covered it pretty comprehensively. I mean, we've only brushed the surface of what AD and integrated and creative AD can be here. You know, it can take all sorts of different forms. It is so many different opportunities, and it never has to show and tell, which I think is what a lot of people are worried about. Everything that John said, everything that Ben said, but also, yeah, use consultants, budget for consultants, explore what the costs are before you even put your application in, and think about it from the outset of your project. You know, if you get an idea for a show, just think about who that show is for, and how you can make it for more people, because that's what you're doing. You're broadening your audience by providing access, and by providing creative access, you're enhancing the show you've already got for everyone. Incidentally, I have written a toolkit on developing visually impaired audiences, and this was for the Arts Council of Wales. So it's developing visually impaired audiences in Wales, but actually it's applicable everywhere. So please do Google that if you want to know more. It's a good sort of beginner's guide, really, to all forms of different access for visually impaired people, including touch tours, model boxes, and different forms of audio description, with some case studies in there as well. And also there's information about how venues can make themselves more accessible, because let's face it, it's not just the creative experience, the experience of the actual show itself for deaf and disabled audience members. It's the whole experience of booking tickets, finding out about the show in the first place, getting to the theatre, and getting your way around the theatre. So it encompasses everything. You do have to think of everything. And yeah, just see it as an opportunity. It's creative fun. It's not an obstacle. It doesn't have to be a barrier. And exactly as John said, you don't have to change your whole process. It's about working with those of us who are experienced in this to really identify the little things that you can do to completely open up your show to a whole bunch of new people. So yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think that's the thing that often surprises people, that when you've got a show that is already, nearly, there's some shows that are so easy, you have to change so very little to just open up this whole new audience is a big one. I realized one of the things we were supposed to talk about, but we've run out of time, was sort of making work accessible, making your processes accessible to blind and visually impaired actors and performers. That's, a whole other conversation. Just to say, Oliver Twist is wonderful. It's not always wonderful elsewhere. There's the headlines. But thank you very much for watching and listening to this episode of The Green Room. Of course, thank you to Chloe and John for being a part of this conversation today, and to our three wonderful interpreters for hopefully keeping up with us rabbiting on. That is fantastic. Thank you to Strive for organising this conversation, to putting it out into the world, and the rest of these conversations in this series about Oliver Twist are all available on the Ramps on the Moon website, so go check that out. And yeah, thank you very much for listening or watching. I hope it was useful, hope it was interesting, and keep on audio describing. That's a terrible catchphrase. Cheers, goodbye.
Thank you.
And our guests, Chloe Clarke John Biddle, hosted by Ben Wilson, BSL interpreters, Susan Merrick, Vicky Ackroyd, David Witchley. The Green Room, a Ramps on the Moon takeover, looking at the making of Oliver Twist at Leeds Playhouse, a video podcast produced by Strive, a collective made up of the DH Ensemble and Hot Coals Productions, supported by Ramps on the Moon. You can find all the videos and more at www.strivecollective.org/the-green-room, or alternatively visit the Ramps on the Moon Lessons Learned page at www.rampsonthemoon.co.uk/lessons-learned. Twitter at Strive Collective with no E, #TheGreenRoom_UK. Celebrating best practice, spotlighting unsung heroes, inspiring action. Logos for Strive, Hot Coals Productions and the DH Ensemble, Ramps on the Moon, and supported using public funding from Arts Council England.